Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Richard Saunders here from Sydney, Australia for the Skeptic Zone podcast. It's episode number 126. It was just 1 week ago, just over a week ago, I was quite happy with myself. I got the previous Skeptic Zone out online. I was sitting back and enjoying the afternoon when I happened to flick on the TV, and there was a report of an earthquake in Japan. And I don't need to tell you the rest. As it happened, I was having a chat to a good friend of mine, Kerry Iwin, one of the Skeptics, and we watched together in horror, in our respective countries, the unfolding disaster. So some of this week's show will be devoted to topics relating to disasters, I guess, the tsunami and previous tsunamis, and also to the interesting issue of atomic reactors. In fact, first up, Maynard will interview Professor David Jamieson, Professor of Physics at the University of Melbourne, about his thoughts and feelings about atomic reactors and his thoughts about the current situation in Japan. And after that, on a similar sort of topic, Dr. Rachie in Dr. Rachie Reports will look at the unbelievable newsletter that came out from Homeopathy Plus here in Australia, advocating homeopathic remedies for radiation sickness. You might have to rewind that little bit to understand it. No, I'll tell you again. They are advocating that you take homeopathy to counter the effects of radiation sickness. I don't even have to comment about that. Following Dr. Rachie is Reality Bites with Joanne Benhamu. And then we have two editorials. One from the former president and former CEO of Australian Skeptics and former editor of the magazine, the Skeptic magazine, Barry Williams, with an editorial he originally wrote to cover the previous tsunami back in 2004. And to round off the show, we have another editorial from Peter Bowditch, otherwise known as Ratbag, from ratbags.com, with an editorial he wrote along a similar vein. Here is the Skeptic Zone, and this week it is particularly relevant to the current situation in Japan.
Here's Maynard's spooky action at a distance.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Hello, I'm just fine. Look, thank you for taking my call. You were very busy with conferences last time we spoke.
Of course, the world has changed since we last spoke.
It certainly has. Now, ladies and gentlemen, a few months ago I was trying to do a story with this man here, Dr. David Jamieson, and basically no one was interested because thorium reactors was something that only crazy scientists talks about in an experimental way. But suddenly, Doctor, thorium reactors have become very interesting to a lot of people, haven't they?
Yes, they have.
And people go, thorium, what is that?
Well, thorium is a relatively common heavy element, like uranium, but a little bit lighter. It occurs naturally in the crust of the Earth, where it's about as abundant as lead, which I think people would be much more familiar with.
And where are most of the deposits of thorium in the world at?
It seems to be fairly well distributed around the world. Some of the biggest deposits of thorium minerals are right here in Australia. I think probably we're either number one or number two in the world for thorium reserves, with the United States and India also with very big deposits of thorium. It's not a very rare material.
Now, the question that's been asked is, if this is a potential use in a nuclear reactor, why aren't they doing it already?
Well, that's a very good question, and experts in the field who have been asked that same question have said, well, it's a bit like going into a forest and cutting down a whole lot of green timber and trying to get a fire going with that, instead of using all the dead wood lying around on the forest floor, which burns a lot better. So thorium is like the green wood, and the dead wood is like uranium. It's much easier to get the nuclear reaction started in uranium than the thorium. And so that's why uranium has had a head start in a nuclear reactor compared to thorium.
Now, the problem we have with the Japanese reactors at the moment, if they were thorium, would we be having any problem like this? Or is the main problem with the Japanese reactors their age anyway?
Well, I think there's a diversity of opinion about that, Maynard, but from my point of view, the problem that the Japanese reactors have experienced is that terrible tsunami, which has washed through the old plant, which hadn't behaved very well. Obviously, it's a terrible tragedy. But what seems to have happened is that the tsunami has destroyed all the backup power systems which were needed for the cooling of the shutdown reactors. I'm pretty sure from the press reports that the reactor, all the reactors on the site there had been shut down, as you'd expect, automatically after the earthquake. But unfortunately, the tsunami which arrived as the reactors were shutting down or had already shut down destroyed all the power switch yards and the backup diesel generators, leaving them very vulnerable now to overheating. But I emphasise that although the 6 reactors on the site of the Fukushima 1 power station are the ones that are causing the problem, the 3 of them weren't in service at the time of the earthquake, and the other 3 were, but would have shut down immediately in response to the earthquake. But after you shut a reactor down, you have to keep the cooling pumps running to dissipate the enormous amount of heat in the reactor core. And the tsunami has then destroyed it appears, has destroyed the pumps and the water intakes and the power stations, and this has created some significant difficulties, obviously, which we're seeing today.
Well, given what has happened in Japan, do you think there would be any interest worldwide, and particularly in Australia, to do any further thorium research to maybe perhaps make new nuclear power plants, as this is not going to make the image of nuclear power generally any healthier?
Well, yes, indeed. In fact, I should have answered your question whether a thorium reactor would have had the same problems. It probably would have, because any reactor needs to be cooled for a period of time after it is shut down, just to get the heat out of the core, because they're operating at very high temperatures. And I think that probably when Japan begins to recover from this terrible, terrible disaster, appalling loss of life and livelihood, that in the overall scheme of things, although the nuclear disaster is getting an enormous amount of press coverage, I think the loss of life and livelihood from just the physical destruction caused by the tsunami of the railways and the roads and the houses and the awful tragedy of people who have lost their lives will greatly outweigh the problems caused by the reactors. I mean, you've got already an estimate of 10,000 people killed from the tsunami, which is really appalling. We have to keep in mind the reactors in Japan have spent 40 years producing electricity with very low amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. We must always keep that in mind when assessing, what's happening now. That's 40 years of not producing carbon dioxide in response to producing an enormous amount of electric power for the nation. I think we should weigh up the alternatives to producing electricity with low carbon dioxide, whether it's geosequestration or solar or wind or geothermal or the different flavours of nuclear reactor. We should weigh them all up and do a cost-benefit analysis, and find out which one is going to be the cheapest and most effective for Australia, for Victoria, for New South Wales, wherever we choose to look at alternatives to what we're doing now.
So do you think if there is a future for thorium in the nuclear industry, how many years would it be away if anyone decided to really give it a solid go?
To roll it out on a scale sufficient to make an impact. So, for example, in India, they want to try and get a quarter of their power needs by the 2050 timescale I mentioned earlier. That's about 270 gigawatts, which is an enormous amount of power, India being a big country after all. And they have a very aggressive program to achieve that goal. So that's an example of the sort of time frame that people are working to.
Well, how do you feel when you see sort of quack ideas of like 0 point energy, and you see guys making an experiment on a bench and they seem to be creating power out of nothing? How do you as a physicist take that? Because every once in a while we get someone with a miracle way to make power that doesn't really add up.
Well, yeah, a good question. I have a pretty thick file here in my office of people who have written to me about these schemes, but it's a bit like imagining someone proposing to the government they need some funding to go off and discover a new continent in the Pacific Ocean that hasn't been discovered yet. You'd be pretty reluctant to put any money behind financing an expedition to discover that continent, and you'd really need a pretty compelling reason why this person thought there was a new continent out there in the Pacific that no one had seen yet. And looking for new sources of energy is a bit like that. I'm happy to listen to someone with a really good reason why they think they can roll out a new form of energy or power generation that no one's thought of before. But without that very, very good reason, I really would prefer not to listen.
And do these proposals to you come in the form of a perpetual motion machine or a completely new way to generate power?
Well, sometimes it's very difficult to say, to tell the truth. It's often difficult to understand exactly what they're talking about. The diagrams are complex, and sometimes it's often just a matter that they forget about the second law of thermodynamics. And I don't want to go into the advanced course in this phone call, but it's not just sufficient to conserve energy in your power station. You've got to worry about the second law of thermodynamics, which basically says if you've got a bathtub full of hot water, you've got an enormous amount of energy in that hot water, but you can't use it to charge the battery of your mobile phone, I'm afraid, or at least you can't do it very efficiently because of the second law.
Oh, look, while we're talking about on the verge of conspiracy theories, I'll just ask you one question as a physicist. There is a conspiracy theory that the Germans during the Second World War were actually able to fire off some kind of dirty nuclear weapon somewhere in the sort of Gulf of Finland up that way. Do you think there's any possibility that they did that? Because, although is that just pure speculation? Actually,
I've looked into this, and I believe it's without merit. I don't think there's even a grain of truth in it. The thing about nuclear materials and radioactive materials is that they produce a very strong signal just lying around, as we all know. We've all seen the terrible scenes of people in Japan being screened for contamination with Geiger counters. And in some ways, you could regard that as an advantage. Any contamination, unlike chemical contamination, which may be very difficult to detect until it's all over, the wastes from nuclear reactors produce strong signals that are easy to detect. And so if such an experiment had happened, you don't need to be. It wouldn't be subtle. You could get your Geiger counter and get out there in the field and try and measure the waste products, and it wouldn't be a subtle signal.
Oh, so on this island that they allegedly did it wouldn't be just slightly above background radiation level. It would be a lot higher.
Yes, and you could actually measure the signals in a more sophisticated way than just using a Geiger counter with some very straightforward detectors, and you'd see immediately the fingerprint of any such experiment that would be unmistakable and unambiguous, and it wouldn't be subtle. It would be very, very clear what had gone on.
Look, thank you, Professor David Jamieson. Thank you for talking to us today and talking to us about thorium and putting a couple of these conspiracies to rest.
It's a pleasure.
I've got to think up some new ones now.
Okay, fine.
Yeah. Look, thank you very much for your time, and I really appreciate this. This has been great.
Okay.
Now on Belfast FM, we turn to the personal ads. Easygoing and confident skeptic seeks other critical thinkers for fun, laughter and good times. Must be willing to apply logic liberally and a good listener. Expect something new and interesting every month. Come and meet me in Belfast in Northern Ireland. If this sounds like you, check out my profile on belfastskeptics.com. Music by Kevin MacLeod.
Now it's time for Dr. Rachie Reports with Dr. Rachel Dunlop.
Hello listeners and welcome to Dr. Rachie Reports. Well, it is said that disasters bring out the best and the worst in people, and sadly there has been plenty of opportunity to witness this play out of late. In Australia, the East Coast experienced the worst floods since 1974, quickly followed by Cyclone Yasi ravaging as far inland as Mount Isa. Then there was the terrible earthquake in Christchurch where many died across the pond. And then on Friday, a massive 9.0 earthquake exploded under the Pacific Ocean, sending a huge tsunami smashing into the northeast coast of Japan. The Japanese are suffering terribly, and not just because tens of thousands are missing feared dead, but they also face bitter cold as snow is dumped on the devastation. And even worse, 4 nuclear reactors which took the brunt of the tsunami and earthquake are now at risk of meltdown. Although the reactors are built to withstand earthquakes, the combination of such a huge event, coupled with a massive tsunami, wiped out backup systems required to keep the fuel rods cool. As water levels dropped, the rods heated up, some producing enough hydrogen gas to cause explosions and subsequently the release of radioactive gas into the air. The manufacturers are madly dumping seawater from helicopters onto the rapidly heating fuel rods, and as a precaution have set up an exclusion zone in a 30-kilometre radius around the plant. However, if meltdown cannot be prevented, there is a risk of the release of radioactive gas clouds which could drift into populated areas. So, enter the vultures. Several days ago, Australian Skeptics Vice President Richard Saunders circulated an email from Homeopathy Plus describing homeopathic remedies for radiation sickness and poisoning. The email described how homeopathy offered, quote, key remedies that have been used either in research or historically to prevent or treat radiation poisoning. The email dated March 13th states, quote, if at risk of radiation exposure, any one of the above remedies may be taken as an emergency response 3 times a day in a 30C potency. The remedies referred to are cadmium iodide, cadmium sulf, phosphorus, strontium carbonicum, and X-rays. That's right, listeners, homeopathic preparations of X-rays. But before you get worried that more X-rays might not be the best thing to treat radiation burns or sickness, let's take a look at precisely what 30C means. This is a common homeopathic dilution, in fact one you might find on your local pharmacy shelf, and means the original substance has been diluted 10 to the power of 60 times. So in simple terms that means 10 with 60 zeros after it. At a dilution this great, in order for you to come into contact with even one molecule of the original X-rays, you would have to give 2 billion doses per second to 6 billion people for 4 billion years. Or, to put it another way, a 30C dilution is the equivalent of placing 1 ml of liquid into a cube of water, measuring 1,000,000,000,000,000 metres per side. Clearly impossible and preposterous, but there's more. Quote, if radiation sickness has developed, your homeopath is the best person to advise on treatment dosages and potencies, as these will depend on the symptoms you are experiencing and their severity. But not just any homeopath. Apparently some people are confused by the number of remedies being offered by different homeopaths. Apparently they can't even agree amongst themselves. But never fear, Homeopathy Plus will only recommend you, quote, Remedies whose effects are also supported by research and or confirmed with clinical successes as reported by doctors and physicians dealing with radiation exposure during the Great World Wars. Thank goodness for that. But what if you can't get your hands on a super dilute 1 to the bajillion dilution of X-rays? Well, no problem. You can take a more concentrated dose of X-rays, but you just need to take it more frequently. Yes, you heard me correctly. If the preparation is more concentrated, you just need to take it more often. According to the helpful Homeopathy Plus newsletter, this means, quote, taking a more frequent dose for lower potencies of 4 to 6 times a day, and a less frequent dose 1 to 2 times a day for higher potencies. Now, this might seem a bit confusing, but this is because homeopaths believe that the more dilute the preparation, the stronger it is. No, folks, you couldn't make this stuff up. Well, actually you could, but no one would believe you. So as you might expect, Homeopathy Plus have copped a little bit of flack for this irresponsible nonsense. The story was reported in the Australian newspaper, on the Punch website, by Phil Plait in his Bad Astronomy blog, by Brian Dunning on Skeptic blog, and by Ben Radford. Adam Creswell from the Australian newspaper asked some experts about the claims that homeopathy can treat radiation burns and got a predictable response. Victorian GP Bill Williams, who is also a nuclear safety expert, said there was, quote, absolutely no evidence for any of the remedies being promoted by Homeopathy Plus being useful in treating radiation sickness. He continued, it's not really very helpful for people to be promoting treatments in a dire situation like this, which could give people false comfort, Dr. Williams said. Nuclear radiologist Peter Karamoskis said the claims that were made by Homeopathy Plus were, quote, rubbish. Such claims are dangerous in that it might compromise proper treatment and give false security. But sadly, this is not the first time Homeopathy Plus have spouted rubbish on the unsuspecting public. The Homeopathy Plus newsletter and clinic are both run by homeopath Fran Sheffield, who, as an aside, is also good mates with the Australian Anti-Vaccination Network. Well, birds of a feather and all that. In 2010, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, the TGA, instructed Ms. Sheffield to remove claims that homeopathy was an effective substitute for vaccination from her website and also publish a retraction. She refused to do so on the grounds that she didn't agree with the decision. And, as with approximately 30% of those served with a TGA retraction order, nothing was done to enforce the finding. In fact, the TGA told ABC's Late Line program that no legal action has ever been taken over non-compliance, which makes the complaint system look like a complete farce. And indeed, following the Late Line report, Fran Sheffield jumped a flotilla of sharks and published a piece on her website called, quote, Late Line, can homeopathy safely protect against epidemic and infectious diseases? Can homeopathy treat serious diseases such as AIDS and cancer? It was a veritable gish gallop of references purporting to show that indeed homeopathy can treat AIDS and cancers. So not only did Ms. Sheffield refuse to remove false and misleading information about vaccination from her website, when challenged she simply added more. A few months prior, she also sent out an email alert entitled, Homeopathy as good as chemotherapy for breast cancer and non-toxic, which was based on a paper published in the International Journal of Oncology. Firstly, the paper had not made such a claim. It was only a study in cells, and secondly, it was a terrible piece of bad science chock full of dodgy data. So much so that one of the authors left a comment on my blog where I had taken the paper to pieces, dissociating herself from the work and saying, quote, I asked to not be included because I did not think it was a sound study. Still, Fran Sheffield continues to claim that magic vibrating water can cure everything. In a flyer sent out for a workshop last year, she stated, quote, Homeopathy works for autism, infections, anxiety, allergies, insomnia, coughs and colds, depression, irritable bowel syndrome, and much, much more. Sorry, Fran, but there is no evidence that homeopathy works for anything except maybe for hangovers. I love a nice cold drink of water when I'm hungover. And certainly the claim that homeopathy works for radiation poisoning or illnesses is complete rubbish. You can find the accompanying blog of this week's Dr. Rachie Reports on the official blog of the Skeptic Zone at skepticsbook.com. And until next time, this has been Dr. Rachie Reports.
Dr. Rachel Dunlop is one of Australia's foremost media commentators in matters concerning so-called alternative medicine. She has appeared on national radio and national television. Dr. Rachie is available for interviews, and you can contact her at rachel@skepticzone.tv.
Yeah, right, guys. I was talking to Richard Saunders the other day.
All right.
He said if we record a trailer for our podcast, Skeptics with a K, he'd play it on their show.
Well, that's nice of him. That's very generous.
It's pretty good. I'm not sure what we could do, though. I mean...
Well, I suppose you tell people what the show's about.
But it's basically just this.
Yeah, But, we talk about science and scepticism and things.
That's true. I suppose you mentioned the website address.
What, merseysideskeptics.org.uk?
Yeah, or just search us on iTunes. Oh, and then we could end with a big song like The Skeptics with a K podcast.
No. Don't do that.
Here's food for thought. It's Reality Bites with Joanne Benhamu.
Statutory authority Food Standards Australia New Zealand issued an urgent recall this week of popular slimming product, the Latin seed. This followed urgent advice from the New South Wales Food Authority, the state government agency charged with ensuring food safety and quality, on this and another similar product, Slim Seed. Testing has shown that the products, labelled as Alurice mollucana, commonly known as candlenut, actually contain highly toxic Thievetia nerofolia or Thievetia peruviana, also known as yellow oleander. This highly toxic species contains cardiac glycosides and is listed in the Food Standards Code under prohibited and restricted plants and fungi. Listeners may be familiar with another of the glycosides, digitalis, also known as foxglove. Symptoms of poisoning include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, coma, convulsions, and cardiac arrhythmias. Interestingly, a side effect of these substances is decreased appetite, and people have been known to use them to aid weight loss. The Food Authority has requested that sale of the products be discontinued and the products withdrawn. Fines of $1,760 have been issued to Balanced Opinions Proprietary Limited and Slim Seed Australia Proprietary Limited, and both have been listed on the authority's name and shame register. Both were found to have breached the Food Standards Code in relation to health and weight loss claims made about the products. These are the latest in a long line of companies to be investigated by the authority for similar breaches. In March last year, Pure Natural Health Proprietary Limited, the company behind the popular lemon detox diet, was fined by the authority for similar breaches. At the time of recording, the website of Latin Seed is directing to a recall notice from the company. No mention is made on the site of the potential dangers of the product. However, an earlier version of the site states 100% natural, no harmful chemicals, artificial colours or preservatives added. The Latin seed is a product of thorough quality control and is harvested, classified and carefully selected to guarantee the integrity and effectiveness. Following up on a previous story, the West Australian newspaper this week reported on the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission's case against Gwyn Graham of the Spiritual Healing Association of Western Australia. The case has been dealt a blow after Federal Judge Anthony Siopis refused to grant injunctions until further evidence is presented. Justice Siopis appreciated concerns about the vulnerability of people with cancer, but commented that the case had the potential to blur the lines between issues of trade practice and spiritual belief. Treatments offered by the group include walking into the water and emerging like Jesus, with claims of 100% effectiveness in curing cancer. The judge made comparisons between Catholic belief in Our Lady of Lourdes and similar faith-based beliefs about miracle cures, stating, "Can you ever find that the conduct is misleading if it's founded on a representation that, I can if you believe?" The case has been adjourned until the 1st of April. This has been Jo Benhamu.
Hi, this is Michael Cruz from the Committee for the Advancement of Scientific Skepticism at the Centre for Inquiry Canada. CAS is committed to critically examining scientific, technological and medical claims in the public forum across Canada. Working with our expert advisors, local CFI branches, and other skeptical groups, CAS confronts the peddlers of pseudoscience with evidence-based scientific inquiry. 2010 has been a watershed year for the skeptical movement in Canada, and in 2011, CAS will continue fighting bad science in the media and the government. If you would like to become involved in the fight to promote critical thinking in Canada, or if you have a concern about the spread of pseudoscience in the Canadian media, please contact us at cas@cficanada.ca. You can also follow us on Twitter at CFICAS and on Facebook at CAS at Centre for Inquiry Canada. CAS, fighting pseudoscience without apology.
The recent tragic events in Japan in the last few days caused me to think about an editorial I wrote for The Skeptic after similarly tragic events back in 2004. This is what I said then, and I don't think there's any difference that's happened in the way we think about things in the intervening few years. Who to blame? Few people could have remained unaffected by the tragic events that began in the Indian Ocean off Sumatra on the morning of December the 26th last year. The tsunami, caused by the shifting of tectonic plates under the sea, cut short 250,000 lives, ranking it as one of the most lethal and natural disasters in the entire history of our planet. That this tragedy touched the hearts of many in Australia is attested by the unprecedented generosity of individuals, governments and organisations of all sorts in donating to relief efforts, and by the dedication of those who went to the aid of distressed victims. This generosity shows the better part of human nature. However, certain religious issues have emerged that are not so benign. Evidence from neurophysiological research indicates that our genetic makeup makes Homo sapiens receptive to abstract beliefs that have no rational foundation. This faith usually manifests itself as religion, but includes various totalitarian political philosophies that emerged during the 20th century, which, while they ostensibly eschewed supernatural causes, nevertheless embraced many of the trappings and certainly the dogmatism of religion in their application. Observation tends to support this conclusion. Throughout history, religions have emerged from all cultures and at all times, and most of them have died out or evolved with the passing of the cultures or of the time. Simple logic dictates that the beliefs of all religions cannot possibly be right. On the other hand, it is an impeccably rational proposition that all of them could be wrong. There is no evidence to suggest that faith brand X has a better explanation of the inexplicable than does faith brand Y. There is far more persuasive evidence that all religions, as constructs of the human mind, are prone to fallibility. This proposed human predisposition to believe and to invent things in which to believe has, like most human institutions, resulted in both sublime benefits and grave faults. There can be little doubt that religious devotion has inspired wonderful art, music, architecture and literature, without which the world would be a decidedly poorer place. Nor can there be much doubt that religions can provide comfort to their adherents or inspire great acts of kindness and sacrifice. But religion, and similar dogmatic beliefs, also has a dark side, with sectarian-inspired conflict, war and genocide remaining as constants throughout human history. Thus, we have seen statements from clerics of various faiths seeking to justify how such violent natural acts as the tsunami fitted with their concept of their particular deity. The tsunami was immaculately ecumenical in its effects, killing tens of thousands of Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Christians, Jews, Sikhs, adherents of many other faiths, sects, New Age spirituality, as well as no doubt many skeptics, atheists, agnostics, humanists and rationalists, who are unlucky enough to be in its path. It did this without regard to their religious, political or other affiliations, age, sex, state of health, or whether they were good or bad people. That this caused great intellectual discomfort to the clerics was evident in the tortured logic they sought to use in their rationalisations. To the obvious sceptical question, how could any hypothetical omniscient, omnipresent and benevolent deity allow such indiscriminate killing? The answers range from punishment for straying from the true path, including newborn babies presumably, to "the grace of God is shown in the generosity of the response from people," surely any deity worth his salt could have found a less tragic method of demonstrating it. But by far the most common response was couched in terms of "God's ways are not our ways, and we cannot know the mind of God," which might have sounded more sincere had it not issued from the mouths of those whose lives and livelihoods were precisely dedicated to promulgating and interpreting the mind, action and words of God. In passing, several of the more vocal clerics chose to chide those of us skeptics, atheists et al., who do not subscribe to their notions of deities, implying that we could find no comfort in our scientific view of the world in the face of catastrophe. It might surprise them to learn that what rational people derive from science is not comfort, but understanding. Part of that understanding is that we live on a dynamic planet where natural forces reign supreme, that these insensate forces are neither benign nor malign, they just are. A natural disaster is just that, natural. Sometimes no one is to blame, not even God. It is not the rationalist who is discomforted by such an occurrence. It is those who strive painfully to justify the incompatibility of a benevolent deity with the horrific events. On a personal level, if not comfort, I did derive some satisfaction when the service in which I spent 15 of my younger years, the RAAF, was first on the ground carrying aid to Sumatra within 48 hours of the disaster, where it continued to provide assistance today. If any comfort comes, it comes from seeing people selflessly doing good when other people are in need. In this case, such people are many, and they come from right across the religious and non-religious spectrum.
Watching the scenes from Japan over the last few days, listening to religious nutcases blame the earthquake and tsunami on the wrath of God, reminded me of something I wrote in early 2005, following the earthquake to the west of Indonesia and the subsequent tsunami that affected countries around the Indian Ocean. It is just as topical now as it was 5 years ago. On November the 1st, 1755, an earthquake occurred on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Portugal. An estimated 20,000 people died within minutes as buildings collapsed in Lisbon, and about 40,000 more died as a result of the tsunami wave, which struck the city half an hour later and surged beyond Lisbon up the Tagus River. The vast majority of the dead would have been Christians who believed in a benevolent and omnipotent God. On December 26, 2004, an earthquake off the western tip of Indonesia sent a tsunami across the Indian Ocean, which killed at least 125,000 people immediately, and countless more later as disease and starvation raced ahead of the relief effort. This wave was not selective for religion, and Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists, Christians and Jews, who were leading observant, faithful and blameless lives, were swept away with the atheist, apostates and sinners. Following both of these events, the question arose of how a benevolent and omnipotent God could allow such things to happen. One of the philosophical arguments against the existence of God has always been based on the existence of evil. This is easily counted in almost any religious tradition. Auschwitz and the attack on the World Trade Center were the acts of men who had freely chosen to commit evil. The concept of sin has to allow for the existence of sinners, as does the concept of redemption. If sinners cannot choose to sin, then they also cannot choose to ask forgiveness for those sins. An earthquake cannot, however, be explained away so easily. A natural disaster which causes this much suffering can only happen because God wanted to do it, because God could not stop it, but because God didn't care if it happened or not. If God wanted to do it, and there appears to be no rational reason to punish good people with sinners, then God can hardly be described as benevolent, and a God who lacks benevolence lacks a possible virtue. As something more perfect than this God can be imagined, this God is not God. Similarly, if God could not stop the earthquake, then God is not omnipotent, and again lacks a virtue which an existing God must have. If God doesn't care about us, then why should we care about him? And if we don't need to care about him, then why does he need to exist in the first place? Over the days following the 2004 earthquake, I saw several religious figures trying to reconcile the thousands of deaths with their concept of God. Those who could be taken seriously seemed to be desperately preaching a synthesis of the three options outlined above. God had done this as a way of punishing sinners and warning potential sinners. It was unfortunate that the innocent had to suffer. This was a burden expected of believers. And God was sorry, but things have to keep following some eternal plan. It was this very form of sophistry which made me an atheist. Being asked to believe in creationism had pushed me out of organised religion long before, though. I can remember the precise moment when I came to the realisation that I did not need a personal God. It was at my grandmother's funeral, and the priest was desperately trying to explain how, in a just world, a person who had led an unblemished and charitable life should have been stricken with a disease which caused her to spend the last years of her life in increasing pain. He finally decided that she had taken on the burden which rightly belonged to sinners, as saints are supposed to do, and as Jesus did. Apart from the blasphemy of the idea that my grandmother was taking up where Jesus had left off, the fact was that she had not chosen to be crippled. God had done it to her without asking. I realised that a God who could do that was not the sort of God I needed to believe in. I should however point out that I had no problem with other people who want to believe in a personal God, unless that belief leads to harm to others. One of the differences between 1755 and 2005, and even 2011, is that in 1755 there was an enlightenment going on across Europe, and people felt free to ask hard questions about God and his works, even to freely criticise religion and religious bodies. 2.5 centuries later, it seems that we're in the middle of an endarkenment, where politeness, political correctness and cultural relativity restrict free criticism of religion. During the 2004 election campaigns in the United States and Australia, both countries with explicit constitutional separation of church and state, the incumbent President and Prime Minister, respectively, actively courted the lunatic fringe of Christian fundamentalism in order to increase their chances of re-election. Anyone who dares to suggest that fundamentalist Islam poses a threat to civilised societies is accused of religious bigotry and racism, as if religion, which is an optional mental condition, has anything to do with genetics. When the tsunami exposed landmines buried in the fields of northern Sri Lanka, no commentator made the point that those mines had been placed there by people of one religion to kill and maim people with a different set of beliefs. I was criticised for pointing out that immediately after Christmas 2003, 30,000 people were killed in an earthquake which hit Bam in Iran, and immediately after Christmas 2004, 125,000 people were killed by a tsunami. And then I asked the question, why does God choose this method of celebrating his son's birthday? What surprised me was that a lot of the criticism came from atheists and other skeptics, who obviously were suffering from political correctness. I wonder what the world will be like 250 years from now. Will the people of that time have recovered what has been lost over the last 250 years? Are they going to be prepared to accept the idea that they can live without the need for superstition? Or will the world have regressed even more and look like it was 500 years ago, when supposedly civilised cities reeked of the smell of burning witches? Think about the good things that a God is supposed to be. Then think about 125,000 people killed in a single day by what insurance companies like to call an act of God. Ask yourself what's missing in this picture of a deity. Remember the last line of Voltaire's poem about the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. He might have added one thing further: hope.
Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone this week. Now, because of the recent situation in Japan, I've put back the interview Maynard conducted with the heart transplant recipient. So that should be coming up next week. But I think that's all I have to say this week. So until then, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia.
You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone. Visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for comments, contacts, and extra video reports.